Good afternoon. So we'll continue where we left off last week. We had given the first explanation of the Gaon of Vilna on the first of the stories of Rabba, that he understands again that the waves are representative of the trials and tribulations of Golos, of exile, and we, so to speak, hit them with a staff with various names of God written on the staff in order to remind the forces that are trying to overcome us in exile, or perhaps to remind ourselves that God is still with us in exile and that ultimately we will get out of exile. Rav Kook takes a very different approach to understanding the Gemara. He says that the message of this Gemara is focusing on a theological disagreement between Judaism and Christianity. He understands that the Nechuse Yama, the seafarers that we're talking about, they are people who swim in the sea of godly wisdom. And therefore, they understand things maybe a little bit deeper than most people understand them. And they explained that the greatest theological error made by the Christians is the idea of God's rejecting, chas v'sholom, the Jewish nation. And that God had initially lifted up the Jewish nation to great heights and then turned around and rejected the Jewish nation, and for that matter, rejected the requirement to perform mitzvos. Rav Kook explains that if that was the case, then why would Hashem have set up a system of giving such greatness to Klal Yisrael if he knew A, that it wouldn't last, and if he knew B, that the consequence of doing so is the horrible anti-Semitism that Jewish people have been subject to and are still subject to in this day. But he explains as follows. He says, the mistake is that Christianity thought that because the Jews had been exiled, that was a sign of God's rejection of the Jewish people. Rav Kook says that's not true, that exile doesn't show us that whatsoever. Because he says that exile, rather than being something negative, is actually something positive. How does Rav Kook explain that? He says that, first of all, this is something similar to what the Rambam says, that the scattering of Klal Yisrael amongst the nation was in order to spread the knowledge of God throughout the entire world. Secondly, it was in order that we should raise up the level of this world to a level of holiness, so that by the time of the Geula, by the time that Hashem would redeem us, there would exist a world that was replete with Kedusha. And so Hashem left us in a state of Hester Panim. Hashem left us in a state where his presence was not easily and readily discernible, and had us keep the mitzvos within the constraints of this world in order to, again, spread the knowledge of him throughout the world and to lift up the Kedusha of this world. I will just add into here that the Vilna Gaon says in his commentary on Shir HaShirim that people often ask the question, why doesn't the Torah in any place explicitly discuss Olam Haba, the world to come? And the Gaon answers that to take a material world and to return it to a state of pure spirituality without any materialism, which is what Olam Haba will be, there's no chiddush in that. That's not a great feat. And therefore the Torah didn't have to bother discussing it. But to take a material world such as the one that we live in and to bring holiness down here and to sanctify the mundane, that's what the Torah is all about. And that's a tremendous accomplishment if we can achieve that. And so I believe that Rav Kook is sharing a similar idea, that the concept of Golus is to bring down the Kedusha, the holiness, throughout the entire world to lift up the world. So therefore he says that the ship represents the mitzvos, which enable us to navigate through the currents of the waters of wisdom, which cover the entire world. I think that Rav Kook may have borrowed that line from Rabbi Nachman and Likutei Moharan and his approach, and we'll see that in a few minutes. He says the waves that are trying to destroy the ship is the claims of Christianity, who say that the mitzvos are unnecessary. And as we discussed in the last shir, the Gemara says that at the top of the waves are these strands of white fire, because they claim that only at the beginning, only at the top, was it necessary to be performing the mitzvos. But today, mitzvos are no longer important. And so we respond by hitting the wave, so to speak, with Ekya Asher Ekya. As we discussed in the commentary of the Gra, that's Hashem's promise that unlike what Christianity may believe, the reality is that Hashem has not abandoned us in exile. And the next thing we do is the name Ka, which is the letter Yud and the letter Hey. And again, the letter Yud represents Olam Haba, the world to come, and the letter Hey represents Olam Hazeh, this world, because Hashem wants us to take this opportunity of exile to bring down the world to come into this world and unite the two of them together. And the next thing is Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hashem's full name, because when we unify the name of Hashem, so when we unify Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, that comes to the full name of Hashem, and Hashem rules over the entire tzvakos, the entire army, and then Amen, 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 Selah, because this will never change. And the Rev Moshe Binyamin of Bavel also says in his commentary that Amen is the gematria, has a numerical value of 91, which is Yud Kei Vav Kei, the four-letter name of Hashem, which is 26, plus 65, which is the name of Adnus, Aleph Daled Nun Yud. And combining the two of them, Yud Kei Vav Kei represents the world to come, and Adnus represents this world. That again represents the same unity. So that's Rav Kook's pshat in the Gemara. Rabbi Nachman has a very interesting approach to understanding this Gemara. And, I should probably say this about any of these commentators that I'm sharing, that they're not responsible for what I say. I look at what they say and I'm giving it over to you based on my understanding of what they meant. I certainly can't promise you that that's what they meant. And especially when it comes to Rabbi Nachman and Likutei Moharan, which is well known, the difficulty of really understanding what Rabbi Nachman said. And I have drawn extensively on a number of commentaries on the Likutei Moharan that I have. So my understanding of what Rabbi Nachman means over here is that we live in a world with tremendous spiritual forces that constantly surround us on all sides. And we have the ability to focus and concentrate these forces on a level of understanding, or just to allow these forces to run all over the place, basically spiritually be battering us, so to speak, but not to gain any control and be able to make practical use of these spiritual forces and make them our own. The idea of mitzvos is mitzvos allow us to take these spiritual forces and to make them concrete, to use the process of tzimtzum, of constriction, to take those forces and make them real for us. Because down here in the olam ha'asiyah, in the world of action, if we don't take these spiritual forces and make them real, they will always just remain something disembodied and something over which we do not have any control or any real connection. And if you think about it, this is why a ship in the sea is a great metaphor. An ocean is wonderful. An ocean is a tremendous life force. It has water, it has food, but we just can't survive in the great ocean alone. We need to create a tzimtzum. We need to build ships, a constricted area within which we can survive in the ocean. And without the benefit of the ship, the water in the ocean would completely overcome us. The same way the mitzvos are those vessels, are the ships in which we can capture the divine light that surrounds us and swamps us all over the place. The waves with the bright lights shining at the top of the waves are like telling us, come, enjoy the waves. Look how good and wonderful they are. But they're really dangerous. We need to hit it with a stick. And he says that the stick was 6 tfachim, similar to the length of the luchos. And because the letter vav, which is 6, is like a state of like the shape of a stick, that's why the Gemara uses the metaphor of a stick. Rabbi Nachman says it's similar to hitting somebody who is acting crazy. Now, putting aside whether or not in today's world, when someone acts crazy, if hitting them with a stick is acceptable or effective, but I believe that what Rabbi Nachman's point is as follows. Oftentimes, the reason why people are acting in ways that we would, in non-technical terms, define as crazy is because they're experiencing all sorts of different ideas that are just flooding their brains. And they don't have any means of filtering through all the things that are coming at them and focusing on anything, bringing anything into themselves, bringing it down to earth. It's all just thoughts, ideas, voices that they're hearing. And the concept of hitting them with a stick is the concept of getting them out of their heads and back into their bodies, getting them out of a state in which they're being inundated with all sorts of forces that they don't have a way of making real or getting control over. So in the same way, the hitting with the stick over here is that rather than allowing ourselves to get out of touch with the reality in which we exist and getting lost in spiritual realities which are way above and beyond the existence of the olam ha'asiyah. So we have to use the stick to bring us back, kaviyachol, to the reality in which it is that we live. One more explanation that I'm going to share with you, and I'm sorry, but this one's going to be a little bit of a tease because I'm not going to be sharing with you everything that he says. Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver, who, as I mentioned last week, was a student of the Gaon of Vilna. And most of his commentary on these Gemaras is extremely intensively Kabbalistic. And therefore, I generally only feel comfortable, or sometimes I generally only understand, a certain limited amount of it. But he explains that what's going on over here in this story is referring to the concept of Olam HaTohu and Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. And just to familiarize everybody with what those ideas mean, is that at the initial moment of Hashem's creation of the world, the 10 spheros, the 10 spiritual building blocks that create spiritual reality, came down into existence in a bit of a disconnected manner, with each one existing on its own plane. Rather, for those of you who have seen the famous diagram of the Arizal about how the various spheros relate to each other, all the different lines going across and diagonal and up and down, the spheros were all disconnected. And that's what caused a shvira, a breakage. And actually what Kabbalah teaches us is that our job in our lifetime is to rectify that breakage. And the next thing that came was the Olam HaTikun. In the Olam HaTikun, the spheros were, so to speak, reissued in a balanced manner and in a connected manner. That's, in short, the concept. And so basically, as a chaver, and he actually draws in his sefer a nice little diagram, he explains that what happened initially in the world of Tohu, in the world of Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, and we're going to focus over here on the lower 7 of the 10 spheros, because the top 3 spheros, Keser, Chochmah, and Bina, there was no breakage in them. The breakage only occurred in the lower spheros. So first, the next 7 spheros came down. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. But then as they went to the next step, they all also should have come down to the next step. Even though Chesed was only predominant on the first of those 7 steps, but it should have come down, as we said, to create a joining together of all the spheros at each place in existence. But no, Chesed, so to speak, said, I'm just staying up here. So on the next level, there are only 6 spheros. And then when creation came down to the level after that, Gvura, again, instead of coming down to join together with the lower spheros in their realms, Gvura said, no, I'm staying here. So on the next level, there were 6 spheros. And the next level, there were 5 spheros. And then 4, 3, 2, and 1. And therefore, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver said that if you would have looked at existence, you would have seen it was in a V shape. On the top row is 7 spheros, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. And he says that that's why the Gemara, in order to make a metaphor for that, the Gemara chooses to describe a ship, because a ship is shaped in that V shape. But he says, what happens in the world of Tikkun? In the world of Tikkun, it doesn't work that way, because the very highest levels come all the way down. And then they get surrounded by each one of the levels below it. And therefore, on the lowest level, you have all 7 spheros existing in concentric circles. And right above that, you'll have the 6 lower spheros, all surrounding each other, concentric spheros. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And he says that is represented by the teva of Noach, because Noach's teva, as we know, was wide on the bottom, vel ama techalena lamaila, but above it tapered all the way until it was 1 amma. And Noach's teva, Noach's ark, that represents the beginning of a world of tikkun after the destruction of the world that could not exist. So again, that's what he explains, that a sfina, a ship, is a metaphor for the world where the spheros were not balanced properly and they were in ship shape. And then we go to the world of Noach, which again, the Gemara is not talking about that, which is a triangle turned on its head, or triangle with a solid bottom, actually, we should really say, in which that world was able to exist. So that concludes our explanations on the first story of Rabbi Nachman. And Eretz Hashem, later this week, we'll continue with the next story.